Hello, everyone. Welcome to the dialogue series, Escazu Agreement, Human Rights and Healthy Ecosystems. This session will be held in English. Para acceder a la traducción en español o portugués, presione el icono de traducción que está en su pantalla en la parte inferior. My name is Claudia Duarte Lima. I'll be the facilitator for this session in the plenary, and we will have a group of facilitators for the breakout sessions. This is an initiative by the Environmental Governance Program. It is done in collaboration with the Stockholm University, the United Nations Development Program, the Latin America and Caribbean Hub, United Nations Environment Program, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. So we're very excited to have so many institutions in terms of this process. So the objective of this dialogue series, and this is the third session, is to identify strategies to implement the Escazu Agreement in synergy with biodiversity-related multilateral environmental agreements and international human rights treaties. So we have had a very rich discussion, and we will have this session divided in two. The first part will be a roundtable in which we will hear from colleagues in different topics, complementary topics. And then we will go on to this part of the breakout groups. The breakout groups, and they will be in different languages. We will provide you more details on that. And that part, the breakout groups and then the reporting back, will be following the Chatham House rules. And I will go into that when we get to that part. But for now, I would like to just start by getting to know who's in the room. So we will have a poll. And I'll ask the technical facilitators if you could start with the poll. So we'd like to know and hear from you, what is the geographical focus of your work? Is it local, national, regional in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean, international, or other? Okay, we will give a couple of minutes. Okay, so could we see the result? Okay, we have a strong international participation, and we have also regional, and national, and local. So if we go to the next question, please. Then what is the thematic focus of your work? Is it human rights, environment, both human rights and environment, or other? Okay, so could we see the results, please? Okay, so the majority is both in human rights and environment. That's great. And I think that also gives us a sense of the work that we have to do as well, in terms of when we have these events, to reach out and share the insights of and the outcomes from these type of events with people that are not working in human rights and environment. I think it's really important that we not only talk to ourselves, but really reach out and see who other people could benefit from this kind of discussions. Once we have the report ready, we will let you know, and it'll be great if you can help us share that. So now I would like to highlight 3 key insights that have been coming from the previous dialogue series, and would also help us frame some of the questions. It was such a rich discussion that you will have also the recordings to look more in detail. So the first point is about Escazu Agreement and regional collaboration. this emphasis of the Escazu agreement in collaboration and also prompts us to think that the more Latin American and Caribbean countries that join, the more the agreement will be able to reach its objective in terms of the realization of the right to a healthy environment and sustainable development for present and future generations through access to information, participation, access to justice in environmental matters. So here the exchange of lessons learned between champion countries that have already signed and ratified this agreement will be very important. And these states have done so in exercise of their sovereignty. So other countries can also see what are the bottlenecks in overcoming that. The second point, the Escazu agreement is not a ceiling, it's a floor. And in this sense, this floor can help us build innovations that will help us also achieve other related objectives in terms of, for instance, multilateral environmental agreement related to healthy ecosystems. For example, the Convention of Biological Diversity objectives of conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing. It will also be able to do so grounded in the realities of Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of both opportunities, such as the rich diversity of plants, animals, as well as the cultural diversity of the region. And also the challenges. For example, there has been a significant concern about the situation of environmental human rights defenders in the region. It would also help this floor of the Escazu agreement in terms of complying with international human rights treaties. I mentioned the Convention of Biological Diversity before in terms of multilateral environmental agreements. There are also other agreements that all Latin American and Caribbean countries are part of, such as the Convention of the Rights of the Child or the Convention on Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. So even those countries that have not been signing and ratifying this agreement, they already have these international obligations. And the third point, this intersectionality lens. The idea is that the more we embed in the implementation of the agreement a gender equality approach and intergenerational considerations, it is that we will be able to unlock this potential for transformative action that was highlighted also throughout the other dialogue series sessions. And here, there were some very concrete proposals that came out and that we would like you also to think about and probably elaborate in your breakout groups, whether, for example, in the next conference of the parties of the Escazu agreement, we could be thinking of learning of some of the lessons learned from multilateral environmental agreements in terms of, for instance, having a gender action plan within the context of the Escazu agreement. And or guidance, for example, to integrate intergenerational and gender equality in the implementation, monitoring, and reporting of this agreement. That in turn, this would help also increase and catalyze the action of environmental human rights defenders. So I could leave it there, and we would really excited to hear from our speakers today. So we will start with Patricia Valvanera. She's professor at Mexico National Autonomous University and has also significant experience within the context of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Healthy Ecosystems. So I would like to ask you, Pat, in the context of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services and its various assessments, what do you think can be done so states and civil society can really use more this assessment to implement the Escazu agreement and trigger this societal transformation for sustainability that was highlighted as a very pressing need, for example, in the global assessment? Patty, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for your question. I would like to share my screen to answer this question. So, well, as you know, this IBAS platform is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that was launched in 2012. And there are 136 signatory countries. And there's a website to which I will be talking to in terms of the resources available and how you can use them. And so IBAS has created several assessments. 3 are thematic, one on pollinators, another one's on scenarios, another one on land degradation and restoration, then 4 per region. There's one for the Americas, and one global assessment, and recently 2 special reports, one on the pandemics and the role of biodiversity, and one in collaboration with IPCC, the other intergovernmental platform on climate change, on the collaboration, well, the synergies among these 2. And so all these documents are found in IBAS website and have very strategical information that could be useful. So on the one hand, for each of those, there's a summary for policymakers. You may be familiar with all of them or not, but I invite you to take a look at them. These summaries have already been translated to all the UN languages, and they provide very strong and succinct messages, and I will show you a couple of examples. And what is really important about these summaries is that they have been agreed word by word by all signatory countries in plenaries. So while these documents are not binding, they are definitely supported by the signatory countries. So these are very powerful documents to bring to the table in terms of all the evidence, all these negotiation behind them. And then there are the full chapters that are only available in English, but that provide a lot of detailed information. Let me give you a couple of examples. So in the recent summary for policymakers of the global assessment, we discussed how much the development, especially in high income and upper middle income countries, has drained all the resources. It's taking resources and at a huge cost in other areas of the world, both environmentally and socially. So there's a concrete message about it. There is data also as a figure, but we also have some text, for instance, highlighting, well, what the Escazu agreement is trying to show, in terms of the indigenous people and local communities being expelled from their communities, all these conflicts and the killing of activists. So it really provides an opportunity to highlight issues that have been agreed upon. So this is in terms of documenting the patterns, which you all know, but it is helpful to have these, but also the solutions. So this is, for example, the one iconic figure of the summary for policymakers, where there's emphasis on the multi-actor governance interventions, and there's some text specifically on how to do it, but also on the importance of values, of the way visions of a good life and reducing inequalities are important. So there are some specific guiding points for these ideas. On the other hand, there are another set of tools available. So these, the ones I talked to you right, are the assessments. Then you have strengthening knowledge foundations, where there's a lot of data, and there are the reports for indigenous and local knowledge workshops. There are podcasts and videos in communications. There are webinars e-learning processes and a fellowship program that certainly people can engage into. There's a catalog of policy support tools, and there's also examples of how these have been, the IBAS products have been used for particular policy and decision-making processes. So all this is available for you. So I just invite you to enjoy and use this information.
Thank you so much, Patty. I think you provided us a very rich understanding of what the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Healthy Ecosystem is providing us with. And I was just yesterday in a session with the judges, and what they were really asking for is we need this science base to make our decisions and to have evidence and that it's reliable. So here we can have a very rich, as an example of this collaborative, and not only from one country, from others. And as Patty mentioned, is also provide us with these, political supported tools in terms of the various countries and approving the summary for policymakers. So I will now give the word to Terence Eddy. He is program advisor at the United Nations Development Program, and he also works with the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program. And so, Terence, we would like to know and hear your thoughts in terms of how do you think global collaboration can help implement the Escazu agreement, building in also these ground-up innovations and realities that are coming from the Latin America and the Caribbean. Terence, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Claudia. So I think this, my intervention will follow quite nicely from the last one about the IBAS and the policy sphere, shifting the focus a little bit more to implementation. So the GEF Small Grants Program started in 1992, the year basically as the Rio Earth Summit created the GF and the financial mechanism for the different conventions. And there was a very clear call for a modality for civil society to access the GF and not beyond what the governments would be able to develop in terms of projects. So the SGP is now approaching its 30th anniversary alongside the GF. And there are a lot of lessons around environmental governance that I think will be extremely relevant to Escazu. The LAC region has near universal participation in the SGP. We only have one country that has dropped out, which we hope will come back in again. And in many ways, it's a vehicle for building a governance platform for government and civil society to work together. So both at the national level in terms of funding CSO initiatives, which are in line with government planning frameworks. And we have a number of colleagues on this webinar who are working on the SGP at the national level. But also in terms of dialogue platforms, whether it would be at the territorial scale, the landscape scale, and I'll say a couple of words more about that in a minute, as well as the transboundary element in terms of aligning CSO projects in international watersheds or in coastal areas which are transboundary in nature. So the UNDP has been implementing this program since the start and has also delivered funding for other global agreements with other donors, and that addressing your question in terms of the global cooperation. So it's in some sense a kind of delivery mechanism for these types of government CSO partnerships. In relation to conventions, the CBD is one of the main ones, but if we look at, say, the Stockholm Convention, and I think the earlier session had the special rapporteur on toxics, SGP has been able to develop learning by doing field projects before a state party has ratified the convention. So, for example, for POPs, SGP developed some demonstration project on elimination of POPs chemicals, which then kind of incentivized the government to move ahead with the ratification. I mentioned the landscape platforms. We've had two important initiatives, one with the UN Foundation around protected areas called Compact on the Community Management of Protected Areas, building governance for protected areas. Just to give you an example, in Belize, that involved working with a lot of coastal and fishing communities on marine protected area governance. There are many other examples in the region from Mexico, for example, in the Siancan Biosphere Reserve, or in Dominica. A second example would be with the government of Japan, clustering civil society initiatives in socio-ecological production landscapes. And Alejandro Ibarra is with us from the SGP in Ecuador, looking at biocorredores de buen vivir and life plans for those involving multi-sectoral governance. I have two more overarching points. One is that the UNDP has worked with the Aarhus Convention to deliver funding to civil society projects in the Europe, CIS, and North Africa region in terms of access to environmental information, which might be a useful prototype model for some form of collaboration in the South America, Caribbean region as well. And finally, coming back to the CBD, we've been working with the government of Germany for some of the targets around the spatial protected and conserved areas, as well as in support of environmental human rights defenders looking at the legal recognition of areas that are conserved by indigenous peoples and local communities. And we hope to move ahead with a sort of legal response fund to support these ICCA defenders in the future. So I think I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join today. Thank you.
Thank you, Terence. This really provides us very concrete ideas that we can build on in terms of what can be the proposals for Escazu agreement implementation, and also this idea of financing, that this direct financing is so important. And I would also like you to reflect upon also the need for safeguards for big projects that are either biodiversity or development, that are also having risks. It's not only that money always comes with benefits. So I think that's another part that would be interesting to reflect. And I would like to pass on the word now to Carol Excel. She's director at Environment Democracy Practice at the World Resource Institute. And we would like to hear from you, Carol. I mean, again, this connection between the global and the local, sometimes they are seen as one or the other. We really think that unless we have this multi-governance approach, we will achieve the objectives, both social and ecological, that are intertwined. So we would like to hear also from you in terms of the specific context of the Caribbean. If you have any reflections on that, and also, I mean, you have a great experience also in terms of global collaboration with the environmental human rights defenders initiative. So the floor is yours, Carol.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for giving me this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be with you all today to talk about Escazu agreements implementation. You know, excitement is building, I would say, until next year when the first COP will be held. And already there are discussions about some of the provisions relating to both the participation of the public and the compliance mechanism. And those are the very formal spaces in the negotiation process. But it's clear to me, and I think much of civil society, both in Latin America and the Caribbean, that if we're really to ensure the Escazu agreement is implemented, we need to take some deep and hard looks at what I would say is maybe 4 areas. Maybe there are lots more, but I would start off with 4 areas as kind of priority. For the first one, I think, is ensuring that Escazu is integrated into governments' processes, both in Latin America and the Caribbean, on climate change and biodiversity, as was mentioned by previous speakers. The Escazu Agreement cannot be seen as a standalone agreement that, that does not integrate into these other processes. How you implement the Paris Agreement or the Biodiversity Agreement is also implementing the Escazu Agreement. Many Caribbean countries, for instance, don't have multiple agencies and ministries that see these as separate processes. And the more that we integrate the understanding, how does public participation, for example, play into climate planning? How do we ensure that, that there is appropriate transparency about biodiversity, forest resources, permits, licenses to use them? Those are part of the Biodiversity Convention. That is part of Escazu. So integration, I would say, is the first priority in thinking about implementation of Escazu in Latin America and the Caribbean. The second thing I would say is I think it's really important we look to the convention itself. The Escazu Agreement, both Article 10 and 11, 10 on capacity building and 11 on collaboration, provide almost a roadmap of where we can start, and really thinking very deeply on what models need to be adopted across the region that will make those articles come into fruition, I think is still needed. There's so many options that could be considered. For example, when you look at the Article 10 that talks about training authorities and civil servants on environmental access rights, how do you do that across such a diverse region? How do you ensure that both government officials can learn about the best of what happens in Mexico, or the best what's happened in a country in the Caribbean, for example, St. Lucia? What are their practices that are the ones that we want to learn from? That will take deciding a framework that works for officials and a framework that can support their learning, their understanding, really understanding their needs, the needs assessment, almost doing a needs assessment, and then supporting financial and other appropriate approaches to build that capacity. So I would definitely say that looking at both Article 10 on capacity building, which outlines a range of priorities, including, you mentioned, Claudia, of the judicial and administrative officials or national human rights institutions, thinking really carefully about how to do that, thinking about educational approaches. Even for students, it talks about in the convention, looking at how you build capacity of vulnerable people. How are we going to do that? We really need to look at what their learning has been over the last, say, 10, 15 years, and really integrate it into our view of implementation. The next area I think that is really key is environmental defenders. We know there's a crisis all across the globe, but especially in Latin America. And there are environmental conflicts in the Caribbean as well, long-standing conflicts as well. Really, I think it's an area that the convention, we need to prioritize thinking on how do we ensure the implementation of the provision in the Escazu Agreement on environmental defenders, looking at what's happening globally, what we can learn globally, and then what is happening in the region. We know from the Global Witnesses report, just I believe it was last month, that I think it was 3/4 of all the environmental and land defenders who were killed, of the 227, I believe, that were killed last year, was in Latin America. And so it's a real crisis. There's a lot that can be learned globally about protection mechanisms to support defenders. How can we prioritize this area for implementation through learning, both bottom-up approaches, things that are being looked at, for example, like collective protection strategies. How can those be integrated into how government looks at solutions for environmental defenders? Other areas are just as simple as how can we get all governments in Latin America and Caribbean that are part of the agreement to even set up just reporting frameworks of defenders who are harassed or threatened. We need a reporting mechanism. Where will that lie? How will the reporting be done, etc. I think are really, really important things to think about. I'll just briefly, before I finish my statement, said we started a process in both Jamaica and St. Lucia last year, just trying to see if we could do surveys of civil society and government officials in those two countries on their understanding of public participation requirements in the ACE framework under the Paris Agreement and how it related to the Escazu Agreement in both countries. And we got some really interesting results, really showing the need to really understand how to ensure that civil society and government prioritize implementation and participation in climate change, specifically looking at the risks that are faced by governments in the Caribbean and the need for citizens to participate in decisions about resilience planning, for example, or even in NDC processes. And we saw a huge gap in just even putting in place ACE planning requirements to ensure that civil society is engaged. So we can even learn through looking at how Escazu can be implemented through these different lenses. Let me stop there. I'm happy to share the results of those surveys at another time if others are interested. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. It's a very rich perspective that you bring us and highlighting some of the key innovations of the Escazu Agreement, including this idea of the rights, specifically of environmental human rights defenders, that there's a huge opportunity to both acknowledge their contribution, that, for example, in the Kunming Declaration, in terms of the contributions of women, youth, indigenous people and local communities, and this needs to be hand in hand with addressing the risks that they are facing. And also, thank you for bringing up this idea of this participation as something core that, as we know, that was also key in terms of the negotiation of the agreement. So this brings a very important perspective in terms of how it will be implemented. And so I would like to now open the floor for questions from our participants. You can put it in the chat or just raise your hand. Okay, don't see any raised hands for now. In the meantime, I would just like to open also the floor for panelists to ask questions between you, if there's anything that you would like to hear from the other panelists. Carol, Terence, Patty, is some specific issue that you would like to hear further from the other panelists?
Yeah, so thank you. I think I was very interested in these different initiatives at different level. In particular, for example, this small grants project. How is it that, so these are very important opportunities, no, for local communities to develop initiatives, and how do you see that the Escazu Agreement will really enhance the capacities and the agency of these communities to trigger transformative change?
Please, Terence, go ahead.
Yeah, in fact, Patty, I noted one very important reference in one of your slides to the iterative learning loop. And I think that is essentially what the SGP does, is it provides a learning by doing experimental approach to test out demonstration projects, whether it's for something to do with energy access for indigenous peoples in their territories through microhydro, as we've been doing with the Lenca people in Honduras and in El Salvador and places like that, or even in terms of governance platforms. So the shorter the iterative learning loop, the faster the learning. I mean, essentially, because larger projects may take 3-4 years to develop and then, you know, to implement, whereas I think the beauty of having small grants mechanisms that you can take maybe slightly higher risks with smaller amounts of money, but then kind of learn faster and apply lessons. So I think every project is trying to remove obstacles and identify, you know, barriers and so on. So in UNDP, we're trying to apply some of these lessons as components in larger projects as well. So it's not just a standalone program. I hope that maybe addresses your question.
Thank you, Terence. We're also getting some questions here from our group. So the first question I got was from Ariana Lippi. Ariana, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure, thanks so much to our panelists for being here, and thank you for putting together this great session. My question was about COP26, which is coming up just in 1 week, and the Escazu agreement. I agree with Carol's comments that building frameworks is really critical at this moment. And I think that that needs to really be expedited at COP26 because, you know, quite frankly, we're running out of time to figure this out. But Carol also put an excellent link in the chat identifying some of the sessions happening at COP26, but I was wondering if you had any further insight on that.
Okay, Carol, would you like to answer?
Yes, no, the UN ECLAC has explicitly chosen also to have dialogue about the ACE framework under the Paris Agreement, and to understand how they can build linkages through that ACE framework, looking at how they can assist in implementation of the Escazu Agreement. And I think these 3 events are just to further kind of dig into the integration of approaches and lessons learned. How can we ensure that lessons learned are built, both looking at the ACE framework and its aims, which is being renewed, as you know, there will be a new strategy being developed at the COP, and looking how that can lead into implementation in Latin America and the Caribbean. Very interestingly, when you look at the Paris Agreement site on ACE and the number of countries that actually have signed up and have a focal point for ACE, there are a lot of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that don't have a focal point yet. And so part of, I think, the first way of ensuring a linkage is, I know it sounds simple, but the first way to ensure that linkage is to have governments designate a focal point to actually ensure the implementation of ACE and design a strategy to ensure participation and transparency in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So I would say that that really needs to deepen, and we need to ensure that there is coordination between climate change agencies at the government level and those who are responsible for implementation of the Escazu Agreement, which could be in certain countries, multiple government authorities across different sectors. So that, you know, to me, that is just really critical as a first step.
Thank you, Carol. So we have here also Paola Fajardo. If you want to also mention which organization you're representing. Thank you.
Yes, hi, Claudia, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm an independent researcher working at McGill University. I work with traditional knowledge and human rights related to biodiversity conservation. So my question was related to the grant funding that is being proposed. And so I was wondering, how do you envision that the process to getting the money directly to indigenous peoples, considering that many international cooperation funding goes first through the state, and sometimes there is like some barriers there to really get the money to the people to implement it on the ground. So how do you envision creating a framework where indigenous organizations can receive this money directly without these complications sometimes at the bureaucracy level?
Thank you, Paola. So let's see, we have here a couple of other questions. I will just give the floor to the other people asking the questions because we have relatively little time now in terms of the time we need to now go into breakout groups. So there's a question for Nouria. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Okay, Nouria, can you hear us?
Hello.
Yeah, if you could introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Thanks very much. I am Noura Mohamed Salah from Tunisia. I am a biologist. I am working now for the Ministry of Education. And I am looking for the integration of SDG into national planning. My question.
Okay, so how do we?
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
My question: how can we integrate SD 16 in such national planning? Thanks.
Thank you. I'll give the word first to Terence, if you can respond to the first question, and then to Patricia as well, in terms of integrating SDG 16 on peace, justice, strong institutions in terms of biodiversity. I'd like to ask you to respond briefly to these questions, because we will have time to do so more deeply in the breakout sessions. Thank you. So Terence, you have the floor.
So thank you, Paula, for the question. So in fact, the SGP has a particular focus on partnering with indigenous peoples, and many of the grants that have been given over the years, and it's about 30% of the portfolio, have been first-time grants to indigenous peoples, which have helped basically open bank accounts, build sort of baseline capacity for managing projects. But over time, what the size of the SGP grants is too small. So there have been a lot of calls to access high levels of finance, particularly in Mesoamerica. And we've been working with the advocacy group of indigenous peoples around the Green Climate Fund to see how other vertical trust funds and donors can maybe adopt some of these practices. And so one of the big lessons is to work in local languages, to have national staff, to invest in national capacity, and so on. So I'd be happy to continue that conversation with you or with anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Terence.
Thank you, Terence. So I'd like to give the floor to Patricia now.
Yes, thank you, Nuria, for your question. So in a way, in a synthesis, it's a long question, but the short answer would be along the lines of the diagram I showed a while ago, that really the SDGs are system vision, are strongly interconnected. And so, for instance, what the IBAS assessment suggests is that in order to think with the whole system, on the one hand, you want to address the direct drivers, so really changing the way fisheries, agriculture, or tourism happen. You also want to address the indirect drivers, specifically addressing issues of consumption, demands, markets, and of course, institutions and governance. And for that, the IBAS and other initiative have suggested is a very important multi-actor governance level that is much more integrative, adaptive, and is more systemic, and it's really anticipatory rather than responding to emergencies, and that is very profoundly based on values, on rethinking about what is a good life beyond consuming and growing, and the importance of addressing the inequities among the different parties.
And thank you, Patty. That gives us a perfect transition to our breakout groups of thinking systemically. We have heard also about some lessons learned in terms of some issues highlighted to climate. I would also encourage you to think, how does that apply to healthy ecosystems? Of course, the Climate Convention, it is also concerning healthy ecosystems, and taking the systemic approach, I would encourage you in your breakout groups to be thinking of the connections also with the Convention on Biological Diversity, that it's an area that has relatively less been addressed, including in the context of the implementation of the Escazu Agreement.